Okay, if anybody can hear me, give me a sign in the chat room. Wow, Helen's going to show up and she had passed her test and is still going to follow through with the class. That's dedication there. Way to go, Helen, by the way. Passed your test this week. I'm proud of you. Okay. This week's class, we're going to go fairly quick, but I've put in a lot of pictures, a lot of diagrams, pictures to help with the muscle memory in between your ears. And I told you last week that I was going to send this PowerPoint out. I didn't forget. The problem is that this PowerPoint has gotten so big that I'm unable to attach it to an email, and I'm unable to attach it in this class. Right now, it stands at on 10 megs, believe it or not, and it's saying that yeah, so it wasn't for the sake of not trying to get it to you. I'm just still trying to find a way to get it to you. But 10 megs so far and growing. I just keep adding to it each week instead of multiples. Maybe I've got to send them in a couple of PowerPoints and break it up. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and start this week on public service, emergency, non-emergency operations. We're going to explain a little bit about RACES and Aries, and net and traffic procedures. Donna, that's a good idea. The Google Drive would be a good place for us. We've got a CPM Dropbox. We'll talk about that later. I didn't know we had one. So enrich PDF it. Yeah, I could up to this point where we're at right now with it. We're in the class this week, so I need to get, you guys need to get your hands on this. So, you know, you're rounding out the last couple of weeks. So, but let's get into the class real quick because you know, we're a little bit behind. I think, you know, learning curve for me starting this class was that I kind of drug out some concepts a little longer than I wished to. So I got to kind of make up for that time. You know, we still got quite a bit to go. And I will tell you that next week, we're going to start hitting some hard stuff. We're going to be talking about electronics. I have some supplements that I've got to get out to you before the class so that you can print those off and have them in front of you to make notes. So let's go ahead and start off with where we left off last week. So when do FCC rules not apply to the operation of an amateur station? Well, the fact is that the rules always apply. I will tell you the only time that you don't need to worry about FCC rules is that if it's a matter of life and death, you don't even have to have a ham radio license. If your life is in danger, you're trapped, you need help, you can call out on a ham radio band a frequency without a ham radio license, and you're not going to get in trouble. And every ham radio operator knows that. So, but other than that, all the rules apply. It doesn't matter if we are in DEFCON 5 or crap hit the fan. If your life literally isn't hanging on a limb, the rules apply. So what is one way to recharge a 12-volt lead-acid station battery if the commercial power is out? What they're talking about here is a car battery, basically. If the commercial power is out, you know, just jumper cables, man. Jumper cables and hook it in parallel. Positive to positive, negative to negative off of your battery that's in your car. Start your car up and get charging. If the battery's low enough, you don't want to switch it out with the battery that's in your car because you won't be able to get the car started to charge it. So jumper cables will work just fine. The idea is to get that current flowing to the battery in need. And so this is basically what parallel would be. Series would be from negative. Let me see if I can get some. There we go. When we say series, we mean going from one positive to the next battery on the negative. When we go in parallel, we mean going from positive to positive and daisy chaining them all the way down. Okay? So Yeah, just hook it up to your car and charge it that way. So the answer to that would be, again, think of 12-volt lead acid battery as being a car battery, and there's only one answer in here that it mentions a vehicle. What should be done to ensure that voice message traffic containing proper names and unusual words are copied correctly by the receiving station? Well, we've talked about this last week phonetically. You know, get used to remembering the phonetics. You know, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, Golf, Hotel, India, and all the way down to Zulu. You know, and once you're in this for a while and you use your radio, it just comes second nature. Those of us that are military, you don't even really think about it much. Once it's in you, it's really kind of hard to leave. But phonetic is always the way to go to ensure that the other end gets it. Also, when we're doing traffic handling, emergency traffic handling, we have a format that we use, and in that is a word count. And I'll get to that very shortly here, but a word count to ensure that the words given were the same number of words received. And there is a verification process in that net traffic handling where you verify the words received so that the sender knows that you got the same number of words that he sent. And that's another verification process. But just, you know, to send messages to somebody, street names, last names, things like that, phonetics are always going to work the best. What do Races and Aries have in common? Well, they're not a ham radio clubs. They're not clubs at all. So, you know, A would be out of the question. Both organizations broadcast road and weather information. That wouldn't be correct. Essentially, both of them handle emergency traffic. One of them is with the government, with FEMA, which is Races. The other, Aries, is with ARRL. And the way that you can remember that, ARRL, American Radio Relay League. I'm going to type that out in the... or the American Mighty Amateur Radio Relay League. I'd have to look that up to be sure. Let's see. Which one is it? Which one is it? Anyways, okay. So, so C could be the answer. Neither may handle emergency traffic supporting public. So it says neither may. Okay, so that one's going to cancel that out one because it's actually either, not neither or neither, but either if you're from the north or the south. So the real clear answer here is both organizations may provide communications during emergencies. And again, the best way to, okay, so it's amateur radio emergency service, but ARRL is Amateur Radio Relay League. And they're more of a private entity. For so many years they're still trying to get in with emergency management services, but EMS and emergency management tend to have an affection for Races. The problem is that there aren't never enough members in Races because you have to take so many courses, and there's so much that goes into being a member of Races that it's discouraging to a lot of people because you're constantly taking classes and getting certified. So inevitably, Aries wins at the end of the day because emergency management services tend to go to RACES first from the federal level, and then they go and pull from their Aries from their local level. And most radio clubs have an Aries chapter in them. Not all, but most do. And typically the people that show an interest in that, to be an Aries, you as a technician, you're absolutely qualified to be an Aries if you want. The only thing you need to do to be an Aries is you have to be technician class, not a radio operator. You have to pass 4 FEMA certificates. There's ICS, which is Incident Command System, 100, 200, 700, and 800. There's 4 of them. They're free. You do them online. They're self-study. Study at your own pace. They provide you all the materials to do it. I suggest as a prepper that, you know, again, it's not set pace. You can do it on your own time, but I would take the courses just so you understand how the incident command system structure works. I have all 4. I'm not a member of Aries. I never will be. I only got the certificates because, again, I wanted to know how the structure works so that when I hear the radio traffic, I can make better sense of it. I'm going to turn on my so this book right here that I'm showing you up on your, let's see here. I'll show you up on my screen. Boy, it looks like I'm getting I guess it didn't work too well if you didn't see that. Anyways, they have a couple of books that you can get that have the most commonly used frequencies, and they pretty much, it's just good intel to have so you know where assets are around you in times of disasters. If they're close to you, it's a good thing to know about, Aries. So RACES is Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service. Again, they work with the government directly. There's a vetting process and a screening process to be a member of RACES. And again, they just have far too few members to really be of any effect. And I would say that Aries is what you're going to hear about the most. You always remain a civilian when you're in Aries. When you're with RACES, you work for the government. You get a restricted pass that takes you into areas that nobody else can go into. Typically you're passing higher level information, secured information, law enforcement information, things like that, that Aries probably wouldn't be passing. So again, both of them do good work, and both of them are emergency communications. That's what you really need to know. That's what they're geared towards. Both of them have emergency in the name, emergency service in the name. Okay? Which of the following describes the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service? So, again, RACES, you could call it RACES if you want, but in the ham community, they call it RACES. And pretty much when you read all of these, you know, that it applies to them. The main, I think, B as in boy, Bravo, I think, is really what stands them out from Aries, and that is that it's a radio service that uses amateur stations and frequencies for civil defense communications and for emergency management. You're not going to see Aries in civil defense communications very much, if at all. If at all. So, and each one of these has civil defense communications in the description, so that, you know, it give you a good idea that all of these are going to be correct. Which of the following is an accepted practice to get the immediate attention of a net control station when reporting an emergency? Well, there's two ways to do that. Whenever a net is going on, or just like on Zello, if you have emergency traffic, you say break 3 times. Break, break, break. And everybody stays silent. And net control acknowledges the break and says, go ahead with your emergency traffic. Anybody that becomes a net control operator of a net should receive enough training to know that when they hear break, 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 they cease the net, and immediately they relinquish control to the person or to the station calling break, 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 so they can pass their emergency traffic. It could be somebody in dire trouble. It could be a number of things. I've been on a net where it actually somebody said break, 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 and surprisingly, their station was smoking. So they just freaked out. Instead of just dropping the mic and going to get a phone and calling the fire department, I don't know what they were thinking, but they decided the first instinct was to say it over the radio. So, but if you begin your transmission by saying priority or emergency followed by your call sign, okay? Now, I would tell you this, that if you were to say SOS, SOS, SOS 3 times, you're going to get somebody's attention. I would say that if you press the transmit button 3 times, you're probably not going to get the attention. Why is that? Because 3 clicks could be static. It could be just interference. Play a pre-recorded emergency alert tone followed by your call sign. The problem with that answer is that who has a pre-recorded emergency alert tone readily available to play? Have you ever heard anybody that had that capability? So when you look at all of these, really the only one that really makes the most common sense to you would be just to say priority emergency followed by your call sign, right? Which of the following is a characteristic of good emergency traffic handling? It cannot be stressed enough, especially as a prepper and especially as a relay station. Pass a message exactly as it was received, or else it's not the same message. It's not your job as a receiving end to be the relay to disseminate what that message is and to be the grammar police. That's not the time to be a grammar police. Just pass it, no matter how it's said to you, say it exactly the same way. There could be a reason why it's being said that way, and at the spur of the moment, you don't catch on to that on what the reason is. So it's just the best policy. Just give the message exactly as you hear it. Okay, and I think that's really common sense, right? At the end of the day, I mean, it's, when it's emergency traffic, it's not your job when you receive it to make decisions on it, on whether or not it should be relayed or delivered. If you can't relay the message, or you don't want to, then don't say anything at all. Just back away from your mic or go to a different frequency if you don't want to participate in the relay of it. So with that said, I wanted to show you this as a radiogram because I wanted to show you see this box right here where it says check 14? When we do emergency traffic handling, this is the standard form that has been used for emergency traffic handling for decades. I mean, going back to the 40s. This has been forever, always been around. It works, so it's never really been changed. Now they have electronic software that will do the same thing, but in essence, it has the same fields and everything in it, okay? So, but you see this check 14 in it? Well, it count the words here, and you count 14 words. Don't count your call sign, but you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 14, okay? So that was the check that I was telling you about to ensure that you receive 14 words. If you don't receive 14 words, you go back through a verification process and determine what words you did not get. And that's a whole other, if you ever get into net traffic NTS system, and as a technician, you are more than welcome to. We have a great net traffic handling system here in North Carolina, probably one of the best in the country. You know, the most thorough and most comprehensive. We have more net traffic handlers in North Carolina in one state than probably any other state. We've got quite a few. So, and when you see the precedence, R means regular, so it's just regular traffic. When you get your license, you will probably get a phone call after you get your license, and it may be a recording, but it'll just be somebody that says, I have a message for W4GAR, N4DSM, K4DAM, whoever, whatever your call sign is, and it'll say the message is as follows: congratulations on earning your technician class license. And believe it or not, that message that you get, it went through the whole net traffic system, NTS system, believe it or not. So you will be a recipient of that system as soon as you get your license. There is a radio club. It's in Canada, I believe, and that's what they do. Their little niche is that they welcome all new ham radio operators by injecting messages into the net traffic system to where it makes it to your local area, and somebody in your local area will call you at the phone number that you listed on your application to tell you. So did I skip 7? Let's see here. Thank you, Victoria. I'm sorry. We're going to do it right now. Which of the following is an accepted practice for an amateur operator who has checked into an emergency traffic net? Well, you know, the answer here is pretty simple, because it doesn't matter if it's an emergency traffic net. As long as it's a net, it has a net control operator. That net control operator, as like we did on the Zello net, we've designed the Zello net to prepare you for the way a radio net will operate. I specifically designed that so that when you step into getting your radio license and you go and participate in your first net, you will be acclimated to quite a bit on how a net operates, because it's how we operate the Zello net. So that was done purposeful. We do check-ins. First, we start off with announcements, any emergency traffic or announcements. We do check-ins, and then by order of check-in, we go back through and we do a roundtable discussion. And if you notice in our Zello net, a net control operator, which is me, controls the net. I dictate who's to talk next. And if you notice, by doing that, the Zello net goes very smoothly, and it without a lot of hiccups. And that's the reason why. Okay, so to answer this question, remain on frequency without transmitting until asked to do so by the net control operator. Okay, with emergency traffic net, think about this with all these answers here. Okay, if it was A and it said announce the station call sign and location every 5 minutes, could you imagine if 30 people were on that net and they were calling every 5 minutes? It would be a pileup, and it would just be constantly people checking in with call signs, right? It doesn't make sense. It's not efficient. So really, when it says, you know, an accepted practice for someone who's checked into an emergency traffic net, it's just listen. Just remain on the frequency without transmit and listen until you're given instructions. So thanks, Victoria, for catching that. You guys are awesome. As you can see, I'm the human factor in this. I guess I double-clicked or something. So again, pass the messages exactly as received is a good characteristic of a emergency traffic handler. I wanted to show you this form because we're going to get the next question. It says, are And we'll go back to that form again, but are amateur station control operators ever permitted to operate outside the frequency privileges of their license class? You remember when I told you all FCC rules always apply except in situations involving the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. So if if you're a ham radio operator, a licensed operator, and you've got a Baofeng radio on your nightstand and you go out of town and you leave the radio there and somebody's breaking in, your spouse can grab that radio, go into a closet, turn it on, and start transmitting. Please call the police. Please call the police. Break, break, break. Call the police. Send them to this address. And nobody's going to get in trouble for doing that. But other than that, we always follow. We always stay within our frequency privileges. Even when you're with races and you're with Aries, you can still only operate in the bands that you have privileges for. If you're a technician and you're working on Aries event, you can't just jump all over the HF bands. They're probably going to isolate you to just local traffic. So everything you get, you're passing up to somebody that's a long distance, HF, general, or extra class, and they're sending it out, and they're getting information, passing it down to you, and you're sending it out locally because they're constantly receiving and giving, transmitting and receiving, transmitting and receiving. As soon as they get a message, they pass it on. Get another one, pass it on. Get another one, pass it on. There's somebody sitting there that is handling that traffic, deciding its precedence, who needs to get it next. So, what is the preamble in a formal traffic message? Well, I showed that to you earlier, but it's the information needed to track the message as it passes through the amateur radio traffic handling system. Okay? These other three answers, answer A, the first paragraph of the message text. That would be great if it dictated that there was a formal text given the same format every single time so that you could expect the first paragraph to be. But, sometimes you get net traffic and the body of the message, the very first three words are an address, or is it, or a name, or it's instructions, or, you know what I mean? So, but to show you what the preamble is, the preamble is what I was showing you about the check, the word count, and the preamble tells what message number it is, what precedence it is, if it's regular traffic, emergency traffic, if it's net traffic or training, the place of origin, all the things would go into this preamble. And then obviously your message would be, and typically you try to limit your messages to 25 words. They've determined that 25 words is really the maximum that you want any message in emergency traffic to be. Anything more than 25 words, you really exponentially create the chances of missing a word. And in fact, even before you hit the 25th word, I would say after about 15 words, the words are going to start getting missed. So the idea is to keep it short and simple. You don't have to be, I am going to the store, just say going to store. You know what I mean? It's choppy, but you give the message in such a way that the recipient's going to understand it. So if the emergency traffic was, your Aunt Dorothy is okay from Hurricane Rita, the message would just say, Aunt Dorothy, okay. And that's it. Not give all the specifics about her dog and the house and things like that. That's not emergency traffic. So, what is meant by the term check in reference to a formal traffic message? Again, I wanted. This is why I placed an emphasis on that check early on, because I knew it was a question. But it's another verification process that we use that counts the number of words received versus the number of words transmitted, and you always want those to equal the same. We don't really worry about the spelling on how you receive it. You know, if you spell, there, like possessive, THEIR or THERE, nobody cares about that. It's still the same word, right? That's all. That's all that matters. Nobody in emergency traffic handling, nobody, especially when you're writing it so fast, nobody really cares about your spelling. It's the word that matters, right? So these other ones, the check is the value of a money order attached to a message. How are you sending a money order through ham radio, right? So that doesn't make any sense. The check is a list of stations that have relayed the message. That could be a possible answer. The check is a box on the message form that tells you the message was received. Okay, C and D is plausible, right? But when you look at all these together, what's the one thing when you get a message you really are concerned about when it comes to accuracy and reliability? You want to check to make sure that you got it exactly as you received it, right? So A would be the only way that you'd be able to do that. What is the amateur radio emergency service, Aries? So in order to be an Aries, you still have to have those 4 certificates. You have to have those for RACES and Aries. Aries just so happens to use those FEMA certificates, FEMA classes, because again, they're the 4 basic core classes on ICS. ICS is Incident Command System. Okay, and after a 9/11, they really refined that system to be able to handle mass casualty events, and events involving a lot of bodies, whether alive or dead, it doesn't matter. But when you're dealing with a lot of people, ICS really comes into play to keep some kind of organization as far as where logistics, where your assets are, as far as manpower, accountability, making sure everybody checked in, checks out, checks in type thing. So, the amateur radio emergency service, Aries, is licensed amateurs who have voluntarily registered their qualifications and equipment for communications duty. Okay, you can be in a radio club and not be an Aries. You can be an Aries and not really be in a radio club, even if the Aries is attached to the radio club. You may not have no interest in you just may be emergency communications. That's fine. You just have to fulfill the requirements that they have for membership in the Aries. They're pretty slack. You can't be you can't have a criminal record. You got to have those 4 certificates. I got to be a technician class license, and you got to have the equipment. And typically, if you just have a handheld, a Baofeng, they won't turn you away in Aries. So, but these other ones here, D, it makes it sound like Aries is a step up into RACES, right? So it's a training program that certifies operators for membership in RACES. No, they're 2 different organizations in of themselves, standalone. You don't need to join one to be in the other, and vice versa. They stand alone. Aries is not a training program. Okay, it is an actual service, and they do a lot of training. One of the biggest things that they do with training is they participate in a lot of triathlons, marathons, races like bicycle races, and sometimes they'll do municipal festivals and things like that, because it enables them to be able to practice a net control environment where you have a central radio that's delegating traffic. So they use those events as training opportunities. And usually these race organizers, they know from experience that wherever they hold a race, to search out for the local amateur radio club and contact their Aries coordinator and get him to bring his team in to do comms for their race. So it's a long been known thing that they do. One hand washes the other, I guess. And by doing these type of things, Aries, think about it. When you do these races, you always see, paramedics, fire department, police department, things like that are there. So it gives Aries excellent exposure to the emergency management system right in their locality. Not somebody coming in from out of town to do it, but they're performing communications right in the community with the first responders that they most likely are going to work with. So let's talk about radio wave characteristics, properties, and radio waves propagation modes. I tell you what, let's take 2 minutes. If you want to go use the bathroom, 2 minutes, and we'll come right back. Give you guys a chance just to get up and stretch your legs and get something to drink and use the bathroom. A couple minutes. Some of you might notice that, so when I check into this, for whatever reason, I have to sign into this webinar as Forrest. He's the owner of the account, and whenever we both have the same links, but when I use mine as a presenter, they don't want to work and take forever to load up. So whenever I use Forrest, I can always jump right in and get right to it. So that's why you always see me log in as him. So I need to figure out how I can get, let's see here. View I have to figure out how I can turn this PowerPoint into a PDF. If I'm going to send this out as a PDF, or I'm going to have to break this up into the supplements like what we're seeing on the screen right now. So like T1, T2, T3, maybe I have to break up I didn't want to do that, but I didn't think 10 megs was a big file, but apparently it is. Okay, Helen says she recommends the ham radio exam apps for your phone by Roy Watson. Okay, Donna, you're right. Okay, let's try that. I'm going to do that while we're taking just a quick break here. Give me a second here, and because I really, really want you guys to get nope, it's not. Let's see here. Okay, so let me try this again. Print. Okay, I have to figure this out. It is not wanting to be my friend right now. Hey, 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 we might be doing it. Give me a second here. I think I'm going to be able to attach it. I want you guys to get this to help you study this. All right, I'm up to 150 pages. If you ask for it in PDF, I'm going to give it to you the best way I can. So, and then we'll jump right back into this. Okay, I'm at 200. I got another 100 to go. 250. And then we'll jump back into the class, and I'll attach it here in a few minutes. Come on. Okay. All right. Tech class. Let me. Okay. Let's get back into the jump of things. All right, so we're going to start on radio wave characteristics here. Properties of radio waves. This is going to be a little bit of a trickier concept, but I put in a lot of pictures and things that I hope will, if you're like me, you do better with pictures than a lot of words. So I'm hoping that this will help you quite a bit. Don, I got it saved as a PDF. In fact, I am going to add new files, upload. It's still over the maximum size. Let's see, what size is it? It's 5.75. Crap. All right. I'll have to figure out something. I think I'm going to have to break it up, and it's still almost 0.75 over the limit to put it here in the webinar. So let's get going. We're a little bit behind now because of me. Okay, what should you do if another operator reports that your station's 2 meter signals were strong just a moment ago, but now they're weak and distorted? We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and I gave you the example of when you have an object in the way. Sometimes you just have to move a couple of feet away. And sometimes, and we'll go into this a little bit later, in a couple of questions here, is sometimes your signal can reflect off of objects, off of metal roofs, metal walls, things like that, and send the signal on. So this is really the best diagram, best picture, but just try moving a few feet and changing the direction of your antenna as possible, because reflections may be causing a multipath distortion. Yeah, I don't have too many of these. So why are UHF signals often more effective from inside buildings than VHF signals? What I do a lot of times is when I do my class in person, I will bring a 2x4 that is 2 foot long, and I will bring another one that is 4 foot long, and I will stick it out side by side, and I'll try to walk out the room with it. And the 2x4, the 2 foot long board, I can walk right out the door with it, and the 4x4, the 4 foot long board, I get stuck on each side of the doorway. And I do that because it gives a good visual to show you that on why UHF works better indoors a lot of times, because it's a shorter wavelength. It's not as wide as 2 meter. So I think I've got a picture here. So the shorter wavelength allows them to penetrate the structure of the buildings, windows, doors. The shorter wavelength is able to get out of the building a lot better. So a lot of your fire departments, their radios are going to be UHF. They're handhelds that they go into the fires with. A lot of times they're going to be UHF. A lot of times, if you work in a plant or, a power plant or hospitals or buildings like that, the radios, the handhelds being used in that organization usually are going to be UHF. The downside to UHF is that it requires a lot more power to get the same amount of distance as VHF. So here you have a trade-off. You have much more limited capability with VHF, but it doesn't require nearly the power to get out, to get the distance. UHF, on the other hand, usually when you buy a radio, usually if they tell you it's 50 watts, they're giving you what the VHF power of that radio is. Usually UHF is going to be lower. It's going to be like 30 watts. Okay? So we're going to get into what wavelengths are and what waves are. But essentially a wavelength, everybody kind of knows what a wave is, right? Same as the water, like you'd have in a ripple. A wavelength is any point. Typically they measure it from the top of the wave. But at any point, even if you measured it in the middle, one wavelength is anywhere where you start and the wave makes a complete revolution and comes back to that same point. So up here, it's gone from the very top all the way to the very bottom and all the way back to the top again, and that is one wavelength. Okay? The amount of time, or the amount of wavelengths in 1 second it takes to get from top to top, that's your frequency. Okay? So as you can see here, do you notice that this bottom one, you have a lot more high points, low points, you have a lot more waves? So that's why in 1 second's time, you're going to get 440 wavelengths, full revolutions from here to here. I'm going to see if I can get from there to there. You can get 400 times from there to there in a second. Okay? So the longer the wavelength, the lower the frequency, the lower the energy. Short wavelength, high frequency, high energy. And I put a little memory aid here off to the side. Longer wavelengths, greater distance. UHF, higher energy, shorter distance. And this is using the same amount of power. If you had 5 watts of VHF and 5 watts of UHF, you're going to perform better inside, but you're not going to get nearly as far on that 5 watts of UHF as you would VHF. So for those of you who have the Baofengs, you have an A bank and a B bank. Have you ever noticed that you had 2 frequencies on the screen? One way that a lot of people will do tactical, they'll set up their radios tactically, and that's the next evolution that we'll get into with CPM, is the programming of radios and how to program a radio for your mag group. But a lot of times we'll put one on VHF, A bank, and on the B bank put UHF. Now, why would we do that? Because At our base station, we would put, say, on bank A, we would have 2 meter, and on bank B, we would have 440. On the handhelds walking around, it would be in reverse. And the reason why is because they're only going to hear part of half of the conversation, anybody around you listening. So by playing it smart like that, you're not encrypting your signal. You're only allowing people that have open access to a radio scanner shortwave to be able to get half of the conversation. Just a little side note. So what antenna polarization is normally used for long distance weak signals? Remember, CW is Morse code and single sideband. Contacts using the VHF and UHF bands. Okay. So let me help you understand this a little bit, why it says horizontal. You know, these other ones, once you get up like being an extra like I am, these are actually legitimate answers, left-hand circular, right-hand circular. That's why I tell people don't go get extra. It's the silliest things that you have to remember to pass the test. And right-hand circular and left-hand circular is on the test. Anyway, the reason why it's horizontal, think of your handheld radio has a vertical antenna. You're holding it up. Look on the left-hand side here. Typically, you're holding the radio up to your face, right? The antenna is sticking straight up, okay? The radio signal is emanating from the sides of that antenna, okay? From the sides. And that's why we call UHF, VHF ground wave. Because if the ground is horizontal, the signal is going to travel parallel to the ground. So we call it ground wave. Okay? So the way I want you to remember this is the key word here is what antenna polarization is normally used for long distance weak signal Morse code single sideband. But think, in this question, I want you to commit to memory the long distance weak signal. With that said, you know that your handheld, if you can remember this, your handheld never gets out long distance, right? It's only for short distance communications. When we put a wire up and we run it from tree to tree, then we have an electrical field, our signal, which emanates off of this and goes up to the sky. It hits the ground and bounces off the ground. The signal does. The ground doesn't absorb it. It reflects off the ground. So if vertical is the way that your antenna would be when it's handheld, and you know that your handheld's only going to get short distance, you know that from Fayetteville you can't talk to Charlotte, right? So in this answer here, horizontal, turn that over, it would be the opposite, right? You would turn it over on its side, and you would take advantage of what we call the ionosphere. Now I'm going to get to that in a minute, what ionosphere is, so that's not too foreign for you. But I understand that this can be confusing as well. So let me do the best I can to explain it to you. Okay? But just remember, vertical is your handheld Baofeng. You know you can only get short distance with Baofeng. So the opposite would have to be true. And if you're any bit familiar with ham radio, you know that ham radio operators usually throw a wire up and hang it from two trees, right? Like a clothesline. And HF would be what? Long distance. I hope that helps you memorize that. So here's another example of, and this is what the polarization would look like. Typically like a donut, but I want you to look at the top here. This would be a horizontal. Okay? You see the wires here, horizontal, and this signal, the wire would be going right in the middle here, right through the hole of the donut. The signal is emanating all along the broad side of that wire, and it's going to keep emanating out, emanating out, emanating out until it hits the sky and hits the ground and reflects off the sky. Conversely, on the other side of that, I have vertical, which would be your Baofeng, and that's just side to side. That's why you have to hold your Baofeng straight up. You can't turn it sideways. You're not going to get as good a performance with it. All right. What can happen if the antenna at opposite ends of a VHF or UHF line of sight radio link are not using the same polarization? Again, some of these questions are, I can tell, I can just see through the screen right now. Some of you are scratching your head saying, what the heck? It's okay. I did the same thing. I'm hoping that these pictures will help you a little bit. I know this picture doesn't help you too much. But on a distant antenna, the signals could become significantly weaker. So let's go back to this last picture. Polarization. These aren't using the same. You've got a wire that's coming across here, and somebody is transmitting with a vertical. You're going to hear them probably, but it's not going to be as strong of a signal as if they were the same polarization as you. Yours is on the left, theirs is on the right. The signal's not going to be quite as strong. But it can get out, though. I don't really know of a better way offhand that I can really explain that. I know that it sounds a little bit tricky, but you're going to have to do your best to try to remember this. Okay? Just remember that if it's not the same polarization, all these other things, really what you're concerned about is the strength of your signal. All right, and chances are the first thing you're going to notice on the receiving end of a signal is it's either weaker or it's stronger, clearer or more distant, right? So I'll let you make sense of this when you look at it later. When using a directional antenna, how might your station be able to access a distant repeater if buildings or obstructions are blocking the direct line of sight path? So a lot of times what you can do is you can try to find a path that reflects the signal off of the object to the So this is the best example I could give you. If you were in downtown Charlotte, you know, you could think, man, all these buildings around me are going to block my signal. If you go to if you're in the middle of the block, they might, but if you go to the end of the block where you have a tall building on all four corners, your signal now has has 8 angles. Think about this, 8 angles that it can hit and reflect off of. Because you're seeing 2 sides to if you're standing on one corner, right, you're seeing 2 sides to every building on each corner. So a lot of times you're not going to know until you try to key up and you're not getting out. And you remember what I said, move a couple feet sideways. You know, if you know that you've got quite a number of obstacles around you, try to use those to your advantage. Not too many things are going to absorb your signal. What term is commonly used to describe the rapid fluttering sounds sometimes heard from mobile stations that are moving while transmitting? I think for me, I think picket fencing, you know, really complements what the question is asking when it says rapid fluttering sounds. You know, think about if you were, you know, you had a picket fence surrounding your yard and your friend went riding down the street on his bike and he was singing. If you really listen carefully, every time he passes through a gap of that fence, you're going to hear him better than when there's wood between you and him, right? So it's a term commonly used to describe the rapid fluttering sound. It sounds a little bit like a kid dragging a stick across a picket fence. And it's usually caused by when your radio receives a signal from multiple directions instead of just one direction, because the signals are coming in at different time intervals, maybe a macrosecond behind the other. And that can tend to really screw up the audio. So a lot of times the best way to get around that is just, again, move to the side. You know, sometimes just a couple of feet to the side of you eliminates that. A lot of times if, you know, somebody's in a vehicle and they're traveling and you're standing still, there's not really a whole lot that they're going to be able to do. And if you move a couple feet to the side and it doesn't help, sometimes you got to try to go over to UHF or wait just a minute. You know, sometimes you might be down in a valley and coming back, you know, and have to wait for them to come up on a peak. The picket fencing could be a number of things. It could be vegetation. It could be hills. You know, the person transmitting might not see many hills between them and yourself, but, you know, the hills could be all closer to you. What type of wave carries radio signals between transmitting and receiving stations? So, you know, in radio, we consider a radio wave to be electromagnetic. Let's see here. The radio waves contain both electrical and magnetic energy in the fields that are at right angles of each other. So, you know, a signal, when it emanates off of your radio, it's going in all different directions, right? Two sides of that are going to be the electrical current, the electrical signal, and on the other sides, right angles of that, are going to be the magnetic. Okay, and we'll get a little bit more into electromagnetic energy. You know, we're going to start going back into a little bit of your science days of school, talking about electrons and neutrons and how it stimulates antennas and creates current on the receiving end when an antenna senses electromagnetic field hitting it at certain frequencies. So when we talk about ham radio, almost always, when you look at all these other words here, you will not hear any of these other words in ham radio ever. All right? Electromagnetic is always going to be really the clearest definition of what a radio signal is. So again, the blue would be the magnetic field, and the red would be the electrical field. Now, which one of these determines the frequency? It's always going to be the electric field. Okay, the electric field is the I wouldn't say the bully, but the manipulator in everything. Which of the following is a likely cause of irregular fading of signals received by ionospheric reflection? So what has happened here is the same antenna is sending that signal out. You remember we were talking about that donut, right? Some of that signal is going to go straight up. Some of it's going to go to a 45-degree angle. Some of it's going to go to a 30-degree angle. Now, why are you as a technician worried about the ionosphere when you're dealing with repeaters and ground wave signals. A majority of your privileges are, because some of your privileges allow you to use single sideband. So you can use single sideband on 2 meter. So that when you have your Baofeng in front of you and it says on the screen 145.52 or 146.52 national simplex frequency, that's what the FM frequency is. If you had a radio that had single sideband capabilities, it is absolutely within your privileges that you can transmit on single sideband. You're not restricted to using a handheld or with a rubber ducky antenna. But here's the problem, and we'll explain it to you in a little bit. If you notice here, do you see this one green arrow that's going straight through the ionosphere and out? There are conditions where a 2 meter or a 440 signal can hit the ionosphere and reflect back to Earth. And it is possible as a technician to send a signal out and talk overseas. It is possible, and we'll get into the anomalies, the conditions that enable that to happen. Okay, so ionosphere does play into the mix of your capabilities. But as you can see in this diagram, you've got one guy here, and he's getting that same signal in 2 different angles. One has only hit the ionosphere one time. The other one has hit Earth, ionosphere, and back to him. Okay, so it says random combining of signals arriving by different paths can cause an irregular fading of signals. So as it's receiving, if you said, you know, the brown cow jumped over the moon, this signal here, this blue one's going to reach him a lot faster, you think? So he's probably going to start receiving the brown cow jumped over the moon before this red signal that says the same thing. So by the time he gets brown, this red signal is hitting him with V. So there's a little bit of a behavior of what we call cancellation a little bit. Not heavy, but enough that it just causes a deviation, a fading in the signal. Which of the following let's see here. Which of the following results from the fact that skip signals refracted from the ionosphere are elliptically polarized? Okay. I just know all of y'all understand that question. I can just sense it. I just have just a sense that you all know what that means, right? So what they're talking about is, so an elliptically polarized, I have the term light here, okay? A radio wave is merely a light wave, okay? You just don't see it. But because the elliptical wave, it goes in all different directions, this is what they're talking about, polarization. As clear as mud, I know. This is the antennas that I was talking about with polarization. So this second one over here is going to be broad. It's going to, the signals are going to come off the broad side of it, right? From side to side. This first one, the signal would come from the bottom and the top. Okay, ironically, these are also directional antennas. If you notice, this rod on the very back is longer than these rods here. And if you ever step up in your privileges, you'll understand that these are called directors. These front 4 are called directors. And this very back one is called a reflector element. Reflector element, and then it has 4 director elements to it. And the same thing over here. You can't see it so easily, but this very back one is a little bit longer. And when you really think about that, if you stop and give it a second and really think, the very back one being a reflector, that means it's reflecting the signal forward, right? So pretty much you can tell what direction this is going to push that signal. So that's why they're saying that skip signals refracted from the ionosphere are elliptically polarized, because either one of these polarized antennas may be used for reception or transmission. It's going to receive in multidirectional all the way around it, and it's going to transmit the same way. At some point, that wavelength, when it hits either one of these antennas, either way that it's polarized, it's going to capture it. And it was also brought up that you have a last one here. This last answer, D, has polarization in it as well. So being polarized, it's in both of the words, but you have two answers. But this one, if it helps you, it actually has the word polarized in both answers. Are elliptically polarized, either vertically or horizontally polarized, okay? So if you were, I told you some of these questions you just have to commit. You have to find word association between the question and the answer. And in this particular one, both of these have polarized in them, the question and the answer. Sometimes it's just that simple to remember. What may occur if data signals propagate over multiple paths? For me, I kind of find this one to be a little bit easier one. Being a computer guy, I kind of live in a digital world, being a computer programmer. But I know that if my data is coming from different directions, chances are, think about this, if you were in a room and you had multiple people feeding you information from different directions in that room, are you going to hear everybody, or is there likely going to be an error? And the more people there are, the more likely those error rates are to increase, right? So, skip signal bounced off the ionosphere, yes. A signal can skip off of the ground, and it can skip off of the ionosphere. And I've got a couple of questions coming up that kind of go through the ionosphere a little bit more, so that you walk away with a little bit understanding of what this whole ionosphere thing is. Okay? So, but with this question here, again, what may occur if data signals propagate over multiple paths? Well, what's going to happen if you get your signal from multiple people at the same time? Chances are you're not going to hear everybody. And the more people you're getting it from, the more likely, the more errors you're going to make in listening. So, I'm sorry, I got to put this down. I have found when the term may or usually is in the correct. You may be right, and usually you are. So when we have the ionosphere, so we have an ionosphere that they're invisible layers of protection that keep UV ultraviolet rays. How's the best way to explain it? As you can see, we have these different layers, right? And our radio waves, depending on the frequency, act differently to each one of these layers. Okay. There are we have 4 ionosphere layers. Okay. And as you get into ham radio, technician is not nearly as important, but when you start dealing with HF, ionosphere is everything. So, and as you can see here, it tells you the D layer, it burns off at night and it comes back at sunrise. Okay, the E layer almost disappears at night. There is this term that we'll get to called sporadic E, to where it will stick around a little bit. And your F1 and F2 at nighttime, they combine together to just become one F layer. During the day, you have 2 F layers. They separate. So to answer your question here, what may occur if data signals propagated over multiple paths? Error rates are likely to increase. What I'm giving you here is really not as helpful. The second diagram here is a little bit more helpful, but depending on the frequency and depending on, these layers are not, they're not reliable. They're not steadfast every day. You're dealing with the atmosphere. Okay. The atmosphere is about as reliable as the weather is, right? It has its days. And in ham radio, there's some days where Mother Nature is not going to cooperate. I'm a member of Amron, and I can tell you more often than not, we have to resort to digital because we can't hear each other on voice because the atmosphere is not cooperating with the frequencies that we want to use. So, and because the signal might get absorbed in pass through some layers, it might reflect off of other layers. That signal has to go farther away from Earth and come back down when it's reflected, so it's going to arrive at different times. What part of the atmosphere enables the propagation of radio signals around the world? This is kind of a no-brainer. When you hear propagation in ham radio, it goes hand in hand with the ionosphere. Okay? When we talk about propagation, we're talking about the viability of a radio signal. How long can that signal last? How long can it last, and how far can it go? The longer it lasts, the farther it goes, right? And the one culprit that comes in the middle that hinders that more than anything is the atmosphere. So if it's raining outside, you're not going to get a signal out quite as far as you would if it's a nice clear day. There are sometimes when you can't explain why the atmosphere is doing what it is. It is 75 degrees outside. It is a beautiful clear day. There's not a cloud in the sky, and you can't get a radio signal out. All right, that is the beauty of ham radio, is that you use what equipment you have and you make the best of it to get the job done with the conditions that you're being given. And that's what makes the best radio operator. Most of you are just taking this class and you're just wanting to get your technician just so you can have some basic comms capability. I understand that. But you're going to have to push through with some of these answers, some of these questions, and know that it's going to go it's reaching into areas that you probably are never going to go into, but it's also good information to have when you're talking to other people when it comes to comms. So, remember I told you the ionosphere acts differently in the day than it does the night. Okay? There are some bands that as a radio operator, you know not to use during the day, and others that you know not to use during the night. At nighttime, generally all you're going to have is an F layer. Okay, this F1 and F2, they combine into one. And as the sun goes down, you remember each one of these layers help protect the surface of Earth. Okay? And once the sun goes to the other side of the Earth, then the ionosphere basically takes a rest. But you're always going to have, you know, the Earth is always being bombarded by UV, no matter what. So there's always going to be a, you call it a force field if you want, or there's always going to be a layer of protection around it. And that F layer always stays there. During the daytime, it adds a second F layer to it. Okay? Generally, the D and the E region are the only areas that most of us are really concerned about. Okay? But just know that during the day, or know that layers of the ionosphere act differently during the day than they do the night. So, your typical Baofeng, your 2 meter 440 is a ground wave. And Vhf signals from 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz is going to be skywave. There are instances where 145 megahertz, your 2 meter, or 440, your 70 centimeter, where those do take on skywave characteristics. And we're about to talk about that. So when we get into this next section, what is the name for the distance a radio wave travels during one complete cycle? Okay. And if you think about it, none of these other words really matter. You know, when we're talking about frequency and we're talking about waves, think about it. You have a word of distance in the question, and one of the words, partial of the word is length. Okay. So what is the name for the distance a radio wave travels? Only one of these speaks to some sort of distance, right? And that's the length, wavelength. And again, what I told you was the wavelength is the amount of time and distance it takes for a wavelength to make a complete revolution back to its starting point and start over again. So this would be one wavelength. This would be one wavelength. This would be one wavelength. This would be another wavelength, okay? And what you would be looking at here is 3 megahertz. Okay? Here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You'd be looking at 8 megahertz. Well, let's make it 9. 9 megahertz in the same amount of time. So this would say this is a UHF signal and this is a VHF signal. What property of a radio wave is used to describe its polarization? So A and B, A and B can really, they can throw you off because it could be either one of these, okay? But if you put all this together that you're learning, you remember we were talking about a signal. If you go out and you touch an antenna while somebody is transmitting, you're going to get burned. And we'll get into that later when you start studying safety. But If you've ever had a bird on your antenna while you go to transmit, he doesn't sit there very long when you key up and start talking. It's not enough that it's going to burst them into flames, but they sense that there's a signal that's leaving it. So, and that's because it's an electrical field. Okay. So remember we talked about the radio wave is an electromagnetic wave. The electro part of that is what we use to determine what its polarization is. So what I've done here is, and the best way to remember this is that when the antenna goes up and down, your electrical waves go up and down. When the antenna is horizontal, like a dipole or a wire going between two trees, your electrical current, your electrical field is going sideways as well. And if you pay attention down here where they're using the dotted lines and the solid lines, you can match up solid line side to side, antenna is side to side. Antenna is up and down, and the electrical field is up and down. So the electrical field is the same orientation as the antenna element that creates it. And that's the easiest way to remember this. I know that's clear as mud. So here's another example. So, and what they're putting here, what this box is a transmitter. Okay. If I had, so outside of my house, I have a wire going above it for HF. My electrical field is going the length of that wire. On my Baofeng, holding it upright, the antenna is pointing north, pointing up. My electrical field is going the length of that antenna. What are the two components of a radio wave? I want to tell you that when you go to take the test, if you hit a question that you don't understand, I want you to listen to me very closely when I say this. If you hit a question that you don't understand, keep going. Don't stop. Just jump over that question and keep rolling. Because a lot of times, as you've just seen here, we've had a couple of questions that dealt with where it said electromagnetic field, right? This question here is the question back here. There you go. If you have both of these questions on your test and you got to this one, you're like, wow, I don't know. Okay, I'm just going to skip it. And the next question you get to, bing. Oh, wow. You just did two things. You kept clouds from entering your frame of mind and clouding up your judgment and your ability to discern what the answer is. You kept your mind clear the whole way, and you've done yourself a favor because sometimes later on the test, it will help you answer a question that was previously in the test. That happens a lot. I would say that every test has a few of those instances. So what are the two components of a radio wave? Electric and magnetic waves. So the energy in a radio wave is partly electric and partly magnetic, appearing as an electric field and a magnetic field wherever the wave travels. Remember, a field is just energy stored in space in one form or another, like a gravitational field. Doris, yes. When you take this test, you're given all paper. It's a paper book that you're given for the test. It's just it's Xeroxed off on 2 sides of paper and stapled. That's all it is. You can't write in the book. They give you an answer sheet. So what I tell people is you can clearly see that if you skip one, do yourself a favor and by the number or over where, you know, on the other end, just put a little dash. That's all you got to do. Just put a little dash. And the reason why you want to put that mark there is because if that's one you don't understand, the very next one you go to, you might put your answer in that question. You know what I'm saying? And now you're always one, and you're always one off, and you get the rest of them wrong. So it's okay to skip, but mark that one. Just mark it. Put a circle around the number if you have to. Some way to denote to yourself to skip that one. Then when you're all done, you can go back and look for the ones that you circled and go back and finish those. Okay? So it's all paper book. You can start on the last question and work backwards if you want. They could care less. The test is not timed. You can take your time with it. I will just tell you that Helen, she was in and out of hers. Word got back to me that Helen was done with her test in under 5 minutes, and she got 100%. Now, because she was able to do it in 5 minutes and 100%, I'm sure that they offered Helen a chance to take her general for free. And with that one, now she had all the time in the world to now stop and think about the general. And a lot of times by people doing that, they've been able to pass the general and not even know it. So how fast does a radio wave travel through free space? At the speed of light. You remember earlier when we talked about converting between megahertz and the band, and we mentioned the number 300? There's a reason why we use the number 300 and not any other number. Because and I'll get to that in just a second here. But Helen, I think you were able to take the general. They make the offer for you to take the general for free since you passed. Yeah, so, and you didn't pass it, and not a lot of people do, but now that you're going to go study for the general, you're already one step ahead because your eyes have seen what's on that test, and you kind of already convince yourself, man, I can pass this. I've already seen it. It's not right, you know what I mean? So, so how fast does the radio wave travel through free space? At the speed of light. What is the speed of light? Well, it's 300 million meters per second. So a radio wave can go to the moon and back in about 2 seconds. A radio wave can circle the Earth in a fraction of a second. And again, radio waves are just another form of light that travels at the same speed. Okay? So electricity flowing into transmitter antenna makes electrons vibrate, producing radio waves. Okay? Transmitter sends out a signal, and the receiving end, the radio waves make the electrons in the receiving antenna vibrate to a certain frequency, and if the radio is turned to that frequency, the radio will interpret what those vibrations are, that current that's hitting the antenna, and it will turn it into an audio sound. How does the wavelength of a radio wave relate to its frequency? So when the wavelength gets shorter, the frequency increases. So you remember when we were showing you the 2 meter and the 440? The radio waves for it. So the fields of the radio wave aren't just one strength all the time. They oscillate. They vary between positive and negative values. The way that the vibrating string moves above and below its stationary position, right? So imagine a guitar string. If you go out to YouTube, you can see guitar string in slow motion. When you hit it, it literally looks like a flimsy string bouncing up and down, right? And what it's doing is it's actually going really fast, but it's oscillating. The time that a field strength takes to go through one complete set of values is called a cycle. The number of cycles in 1 second is the frequency of the wave, and we measure that in hertz. Okay? The wave is also moving at speed of light, which is constant. If you could watch the wave oscillate as it moved, you'd see that the wave always moves the same distance, one wavelength in one cycle. The higher the wave's frequency, the faster the cycle completes and the less time it has to move during one cycle. High frequency waves have short wavelengths and low frequency waves have long wavelengths. So think about this for a second. High frequency waves, 440 megahertz, right? We both measure them in the same amount of time. So how would I get 440 wavelengths in the same second that I'm able to get 145 wavelengths in? The 440 wavelengths would have to be a lot shorter, wouldn't they? To be able to put them in the same time slot as low frequency waves, the 2 meter, 145 megahertz. Does that make sense? I hope I explained that a little bit better. I'll explain it again when we get we'll get to a graph with it. But what is the formula for converting frequency to approximate wavelength in meters? Remember what I said is just take 300 and divide it by the frequency you get in megahertz. So the wavelength in meter for, let's say it's 2 meters, is because if we were to divide 2 into 300, we get 145 megahertz. If I was given megahertz and I divided 145 by 300, I would come out to about 2 meters. Okay? So you've already been given a lot of this. It should be a little bit of a review for you, just a little bit, because you should remember us talking about 300, right? So the wavelength is speed of light and frequency of the wave. The wavelength in meters is measured in hertz. What property of radio waves is often used to identify the different frequency bands? So we give the approximate wavelength. Okay? So if you were to take 1 second and 2 meter, and if it was 2 meter, you would get approximately 150 wavelengths in 1 second. And if you could sit there and count them, and you got to 150 within a 1 second period, if it printed out on a graph and gave you an oscillating scope, printed out on a ribbon on a receipt paper, and printed out the signal it got over 1 second, and you counted the number of wavelengths, you remember the number of high points. If it's 2 meter, you should get approximately 150 high points. Okay, so a wavelength we typically measure from the top side of the wave for the wavelength, but if you were to measure from the middle here, just make sure that you measure that it does a complete revolution and comes back to the same place. But for illustration's sake, they go ahead and measure it for the top for you, okay? In the top of the signal, they call it crest, the bottom a trough. The complete from top to bottom of that signal, they call the height. Now, you remember when we talked about amplitude, we talked about AM, amplitude modulation. And depending on the volume, depending on the enunciation of the words, this height here one side of this is going to change. The amplitude is going to change. And the difference between the amplitude and the AM and FM is, AM, the wavelength gets taller and shorter as I talk, right? That's AM. FM, the wavelengths, they squish together and spread out as I talk. Squish together, spread out. Squish together, spread out, according to the signal of my voice as it reads it. Okay? What are the frequency limits of the VHF spectrum? Okay? Now, there's only 3 of these that you've got to remember, and I'm going to show you. You only have to remember VHF, UHF. You only have to remember these 3. Okay? And the way that you know, I'll tell you the best way that you can remember this is, if you can remember that VHF is 2 meter, right? VHF is 2 meter. If you divide 300 by 2, you get 150. 150 falls right in the middle here, right? So you know that that's VHF. UHF is between 300 and 3,000. It's 70 centimeters, or 440 megahertz. If you can remember that UHF is 440, you would know that it would fall right in between here. So these next 3 questions are going to be talking about HF, VHF, and UHF. You don't have to worry about any of these other ones, just these 3 on the test. Okay? Only ones you got to worry about. So for this one again, VHF is 150 megahertz, 30 to 300 megahertz. Next one, UHF is 440, right? We're always going to be dealing megahertz. So 2 of these are out of the question. Got to pay attention to the kilohertz, right? 2 of those we knock right off the top. The 30 to 300, that's VHF. We just did it. So 440 megahertz is UHF frequency. It would fall in letter D. And HF is 3 to 330. I'm sorry, 3 to 30. And again, remember the number 300. If you want to know what 3 megahertz is, 3 divided into 300 is what? If you want to know what band 30 is, what 30 megahertz is, it'd be about the 10 meter band, right? 300 divided by 30, 10 meter. Now, you do have some 10 meter privileges, so you do have just a sliver of HF privileges. It's a very small, very small. And if you look at that band plan, you'll see that you get like half a megahertz, like 0.5 of the 10 meter band on the lower end is yours as a technician. So I hope that that helps you memorize these, okay? If all you got to worry about it is UHF and VHF, and you know what those are, you're only going to deal with these 3. These should be really easy to remember. What is the approximate velocity of a radio wave as it travels through free space? The quickest way to remember this is 300, right? 300 million meters per second is the speed of light. Why are direct, not via a repeater, UHF signals rarely heard from stations outside your coverage area? Because UHF signals usually aren't reflected by the ionosphere. The frequency is so high that they just go right through the ionosphere, okay? The ionosphere isn't thick enough. The electrons in the ionosphere aren't dense enough for that signal to reflect the signal back to Earth. So it just goes up and keeps going. Okay? Now, there are times when it will reflect, and we're about to get to that. Which of the following might be happening when VHF signals are being received from long distances? Signals are being refracted from a sporadic E layer. So, let's go back to our ionosphere, right? We have 4 layers here. Sometimes there are temperature differences in the atmosphere that cause the air to be denser in some areas than not in others, right? Some people call them thermals. You know, if you ever been out in the meadow in the country and you see all those chiggers and gnats all congregating in one little area in the right in the middle of the field, about 6-10 feet up or whatever, and they just sitting there swarming around, they've hit a thermal and they're in a warm pocket and they're thriving in that warm pocket. Okay. Well, your radio signal does the same thing. When it hits that dense air, that little pocket of air can serve as a reflector for the signal and cause the signal to, instead of passing through the layer, cause it to reflect it back. Okay? So it says small areas of the E layer can become very highly ionized so that VHF signals can be reflected. Okay? So that's one of the conditions, anomalies that can happen with a VHF signal and why it can travel the distance. But you don't know when those will happen. They're sporadic. They happen, Jesus Christ creates those, and we have no way in able to determine. The weatherman tells you high pressure systems coming in. It has nothing to do with that. It literally can be a patch 2 foot wide, 2 square feet, and your signal just so happens to hit it and reflect it. That's how crazy it can get. Okay. So that's why sometimes if you're tuned to a certain station, I've been on 2 meter and all of a sudden for a few seconds, I heard, a foreign language and then it went away. What is the characteristics of VHF signals received via auroral reflection? The signals exhibit rapid fluctuations of strength and often the sound is distorted. And here's why. Everybody's kind of heard Northern Lights. No, I'm not talking about, anyways. So, and what happens here is there's gases that are trapped in the air that are let off in our atmosphere, and the atmosphere keeps them from dissipating, and they kind of levitate in the air. Well, if those gases can levitate in the air, and there's a reaction in the air that happens, and that's why we get the light reflections that we do. And I'm sure we might have some science buffs can go way deeper than that. I'm going to keep it simple and stupid and with my explanation. But if it's able to do that with gases and keep those levitated, your signal, when you send that out, if that gas in the air that's causing these lights is dense enough, it will reflect your signal. The problem is because there's a gaseous state that's hanging in, that's suspended in the air, it will cause somewhat of a fluctuation in your signal. Okay. So, with the ionized gases of northern lights and what is it, the aurora borealis or whatever they call it, you can take advantage of that. But I will tell you that if you're ever traveling or, that you have to use a directional antenna. Your signal has to be very specific and purposeful. Okay. Because you have to aim all of your radio signal into that anomaly, into that aurora, for it to reflect it. Okay. If you just have an omnidirectional signal, not enough of your signal is going to hit it to be intelligible long distance, in other words. So, and usually if you have enough experience, us down here in North Carolina, we don't experience this very much, but those radio operators that live up in Canada and Newfoundland and British Columbia, they're used to it. They're used to the anomaly, and they could tell you when they hear it, they know exactly what it is because they hear it somewhat on a semi-regular basis to get the experience. We don't have any auroral reflections here in North Carolina, very rarely. But they don't give the test just to North Carolinians, North Kakalaki-ians. So you have to suck it up, Buttercup, and take the test like a Northerner, I guess. Which of the following propagation types is most commonly associated with occasional strong over-the-horizon signals on the 10, 6, and 2 meter bands? Okay. I would say with the sporadic E, remember when we go back to explaining that, here's a good example. Here's that warm air, that highly dense ionized air. Your signal goes up and gets trapped in it. And as that air is moving, your signal is going with it and reflects it to where you just don't, it provides kind of a duct, is what they call it. Okay. So, and 6 meter, 2 meter, and 10 meter are usually 6 meter is the best performer. Usually when this happens with 2 meter, it's literally just for a second. You'll hear a blip of a signal and tell that it's not local, and then it's gone away. 6 meter, when it does it, it can last for several minutes. And 10 meter as well. So when I get this out to you guys, you can read this and help explain it a little bit more to you. Which of the following effects might cause radio signals? That's right, David, you're absolutely right. Key word here is occasional, and an answer has sporadic. Good job. Thanks for you guys pointing that out. You're on the ball. So you have occasional in the word and the question, and sporadic, same meaning in the answer. And sometimes, man, that's what you got to do for this test, man. Don't try to be a rock star and say, well, I want to know this so that I know it and I'm a good radio operator. You only become a good radio operator with experience. There is no test that is going to define you as a good radio operator. Okay. No jabs at Helen, but Helen got 100% on her test. It doesn't mean that she's going to be the best radio operator anybody's ever heard. You know, so I took my extra exam 3 times before I passed it. So, but I'm an extra, right? That's all that matters. Which of the following effects might cause radio signals to be heard despite obstructions between transmitting and receiving stations? A knife edge diffraction. Okay. Now, don't worry about the diffraction part. The knife edge, when I show you, what happens is, have you ever, whenever light hits water and it refracts it and bends that light, remember, a radio wave is light, right? It's a form of light. Well, when a radio wave hits an object and it skims just the edge of the object, it can cause that radio wave to bend and refract a little bit. And that's what you're seeing here. The signal diffracted at reduced strength. Now, it doesn't, if it's leaving this at 50 watts and it hits something and causes a knife edge, it's going to lose a little bit of its signal. If this signal were to hit broadside of this hill, that it would be all over with. You would never hear anything, but it just skims the top of this hill to where somebody at the base of the hill would hear it versus having to go 2 miles out to see the tip of the, because you remember line of sight, right? And the same thing at this bottom illustration here. If the signal just skims over the top of an object, it can refract it, bend it, and it doesn't just bend it in one direction, it bends it in multiple directions. So, but think of when the light hits water, it refracts it and bends a little bit. Same thing, radio wave being light. That's right, Helen. No idea how to use the radio, and don't feel bad. Everybody, when you pass your test, the first thing you're going to say when you get in your car is you're going to be like, yes, now what? Everybody says it. 2 words they say when they get in the car, now what? So what mode is responsible for allowing over-the-horizon VHF and UHF communications to ranges of approximately 300 miles on a regular basis? Goes back to that tropospheric scatter, okay? Remember that warm air we were talking about? The warm, densely ionized air can grab a signal and reflect it back instead of letting it pass through the atmosphere and keep going up into space. It can actually reflect it and send it. And the reason why they say approximately 300 miles is because, you know, when it hits that cloud, it's only got a certain lifespan to it. So when it hits it, you know, typically, you know, the ducts can be approximately about 1,000 feet up. And the time that it takes for it to hit that warm duct and the general angle that it hits it at, generally tropospheric ducting is going to be about 300 miles, give or take. 400, 250, but you get the idea. It's not going to be, you're not going to talk to Russia, but you might talk to Tennessee. What band is best suited for communicating via meteor scatter? And really, technically, A, B, and C are good answers. This one, I just need you to remember it. I can just tell you, I just need you to remember it because technically A and B are good answers. They typically perform very close. You're talking 30 megahertz and 50 megahertz. Really, honestly, when we're dealing with 3 megahertz up to 440, isn't 30 and 50 really close to each other, right? So these act quite the same characteristics. So, but for 2 stations to communicate via meteor scatter, the meteor must pass through the ionosphere in a useful direction and at mutually visible elevations, meaning the receiving party has to be able to see it like you can. The best directions are tangent to the straight line path between the stations. The best elevations are 45 degrees or less, but still above the horizon. The trail left by a typical meteor reflects radio waves from a few seconds to a few minutes, depending on the size and speed of that meteor itself. Man, David, you're just too much, man. You know, David, if that's the way it works for you, man, meteor's got 6 characters, so 6 meters, buddy, that make it stick, man. That's good. That's awesome. You're telling me things that I wouldn't even recognize. So you might have your silly way of remembering things. Dave is certainly finding his niche and how to remember these, and you're going to have to too. So at 28 and 50 megahertz, remember, there's only a difference here of about 20 megahertz. That ain't a whole lot. An active meteor can sustain propagation at 30 seconds to several minutes. At 2 meter, which is 145 megahertz or 150 megahertz, the same meteor burst will allow communications only for a few seconds, at the very most a minute. UHF at 440, now we've gone from 150 to 440. It's a blip. It's a burp. Will the car in space help? That's too far. I laughed when I saw that. I thought that was actually fake when I saw that. It just didn't look real. But you know, you got to have silly, and I say this lighthearted, but you got to have FU money if you can just put a car up in space with a dummy dressed in a spacesuit in it just for S&Gs, just for the giggles, right? I mean, you got to have too much money. So again, when I go back and I look at this, A and B are very, I don't know why they don't say A and B and give you a combination answer, because both of these can act quite similar to each other. There might be a more technical reason, but just remember, meteor has 6 letters, and so 6 meters, like Dave said. What causes tropospheric ducting? Well, it's pretty simple. When you think of troposphere, right? We think of tropic. And what's the one thing that makes tropical stand out? Is temperature, right? And only one of these has anything to do with temperature. That clearly puts it in front of you. So temperature inversions in the atmosphere. You know, tropospheric ducting, to me, when I hear that word, I think of a warm pocket of air, right? So temperature inversion in the atmosphere. So, and this kind of tells you where it can bounce around a little bit and it can hang up there for a little bit, but it's only going to have a certain amount of life to it, and it's got to come back down, okay? And this is kind of this diagram that I have over here is the best, really, example I can give you of troposphere, of what tropospheric ducting is. Typically on the same 2 meter, you would only be able to go ground plane, remember, parallel with the Earth's surface. But that signal, when you're putting out a signal, it's going 360 degrees all around you. On your Baofeng, it's all around you. You know, 5 watts isn't going to get very far, so you're not going to see a whole lot of performance in a tropospheric ducting. But if you had a 50-watt radio, yeah, you very well could see this anomaly happen. What is generally the best time for long distance 2 meter band propagation via the F layer? Okay, so the D layer and E layer only happen at daytime, okay? These burn off at night, and F1 and F2 only become 1 layer. At night, you only have 1 ionosphere, the very top one up here, okay? And that's why we're able to get the long distances that we can, and why we're able to get better signals at night for the most part. So if D burns off and E burns off are only available during the daytime, from dawn to shortly after sunset during periods of high sunspot activity. So you got to remember, the sun's UV rays ionize the atmosphere, the ionosphere, okay? And the UV rays charge the ionosphere. You know, the more UV that we have, the more work that these layers are doing to kind of protect. If we had the full force of the sun's UV rays, we would cook if we didn't have the protection of the different layers of atmosphere. So at nighttime, when the sun goes down, when the sun travels the other side of the earth, all those layers aren't needed, right? But he's still always going to have 1 layer. And it's a constant rotation. It constantly does this over and over and over again. What is the radio horizon? We're almost done here. I do hope that the PDF is clear. So what is the radio horizon? It's the distance over which 2 stations can communicate by direct path. So this is the best way to... Radio horizon is typically you can only transmit out about with simplex, only about 3.5, 4 miles. If your antenna was 6 feet off the ground before you hit the curvature of the earth in your signal, and this is if you were in Kansas in a flat, so you know you're in hill country. Obviously, you're in a whole different ball game. But what they're talking about radio horizon is how much can your signal travel before the curvature of the earth affects that signature. Why do VHF and UHF radio signals usually travel somewhat farther than the visual line of sight distance between two stations? Again, it goes back to that knife edge, remember? As soon as it hits this edge here, it bends a little bit. It goes back to that knife edge concept. Okay? So the radio wave thinks that the earth is a little bit flatter than it is. Which of the following bands may provide long-distance communications during the peak of the sunspot cycle, 6 or 10 meter? Okay. We are done. Now, hang in there. Hang in there for a second. We're going to try to make this work here. I want to make sure that you guys can get. I'm going to try to zip. I'm going to add to archive. Zip, 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 zip. Okay. Give me a second. Well, that didn't transfer very much. Hold on here. P-zip, add to archive. I'm zipping it right now, folks. I'm going to see if I'm so close. 5.75. All right. Let me see if I can do it. Hold on. Add new files. I'm adding it right now. God, please do it. Please do it. Yes. All right, sending it, guys. Webinar presentation PowerPoint. Okay. Now let's see if I have it in my file section. Hold on here. Just hang in with me. I'm almost done. Okay. Webinar. Appreciate you guys hanging in there. Okay, it's coming right. Okay, if you go over to the file section, you should see webinar presentation PowerPoint. Did you guys let me know if you're getting it so I know that somebody's getting it? If one is, two is, then I know that it's going good. I've had to zip it. The files here in this are limited to 5 megs, and this PowerPoint was, I got it down to 5.75 on a PDF. So I had to, I don't know what it looks like on your end, but I have an icon that's a little piece of paper with the corner bent over, and it's file sharing to me. You guys seeing it? Okay, good. Okay, good. And everybody, if you're here, You should be getting this PowerPoint. You'll get everything that you've been looking at. You'll get it. You're getting the real deal. So I'll be adding to it next week. I've got something else that I've got to put out here. Let me see if let me see here. Okay, I've got one more file that I want to share. You got it now? Can I save it to a flash drive instead of the computer? You know, I guess when you start downloading it, I imagine it'll ask, you'll have an option to save as. Just don't just save it, but save as, and then when you save as, you'll direct it to the location and the file name you want to save it as. So that's right. It says webinar presentation PowerPoint. This is what we've been seeing the whole time that we've been going over. This is every question up to this point and all the graphic, everything that you've been seeing, you're getting it. As I've been scrolling through it, you're getting it as up to tonight. Okay, I've got one more file, Natty. How many weeks still left that you will give these Tuesday night presentations? Okay, so tonight we were on number 5, week number 5, and you guys, I am so proud of you. I have to stop and say that. I really, truly, in the bottom of my heart, I'm proud of you guys for sticking in. I really been shocked that this number of people have stayed with it. Usually, statistically, if I have 50 people start, I end up with 1/5 of that crossing the finish line. I only end up with like 10 people that finish. So with that said, we're going to go 2 more weeks. And then on the 8th week, which is on it's March 13th. March 13th is a Tuesday. March 13th will be our last class. And that night we will finish up maybe a first half hour. So, and the rest of the night we're going to do review. So, you know, you guys study, and then on that last night on the 8th, any questions that you have, we'll probably do a phone conference too, so we can talk about it over voice. There might be a delay between what we see in the webinar and voice, but we're going to do as much review on that week 8. But content-wise, on the 6th, March 6th will be the last class, full webinar class. And the 13th will be a little bit, but then will be review. March 17th, Cape Fear is going to have their test. Cape Fear is out on the coast. If any of you want to go out there, you can take it on the 17th, or if you want to wait, I will need to find out what proximity that you live near. You know, if you live near Asheville, if you live near Raleigh, if you live near Charlotte or Greensboro, you know, you tell me the closest nominal city that you live near, and I will try to find a radio club or I will find a testing location for you, and at least get you some information on contacting them on when their next test will be, if I can't find out when the next test will be. So I want to make sure that I at least get that information to you. You get to the information, because you might not be ready to take the test on the 17th or the 24th, or, you know, you might need a month, and that's okay. But I will tell you this, keep in mind, June 30th, you have about 3 months. June 30th is the last time you can take this version of the test. After June 30th of this year, we get a whole new test. It doesn't change drastically, but questions will change, and we don't know which ones. It's a potluck. We just don't know. But the same concepts will be there. So my point is that if you memorize 100 questions, you might be set back a little bit because, you know, 50 of those might have changed. You get my choice? You get my what I'm saying? So the Ham Fest is on, I believe, Charlotte Ham Fest is, I think, is coming up. Yeah, it's like I think it's like the 11th March. You know, and you're welcome to go. Man, it's $15. I mean, I don't think that's a whole lot of money. If you go take it, you might. Helen will tell you that when Helen walked in to take hers, I'm sure she wasn't thinking that she was going to get 100. I'm sure she was floored when she got it. I'm proud of you, Helen. But you never know, man. You go in there and bam, you hit a home run and knock it out. You might know more than you think you do. So, so with that said, I have one more file that I would like to share with you, and it's going to be for next week. And the reason why I want to share with it now is because I'd like for you to print it off, if you can, so that when we have our class next week, you will have something that you can write. Okay. Handout resource. Okay, I got a new file I'm sending you. Handout resource is the title of it. Download this, and if you can, print it out for next week. And this will help you. Once you open it, you'll see why I want you to print it out, because I want you to be able to write around the, you know, there's a lot of, it's just pictures. That's all it is. But I want you to be able to write around it and write notes as we're talking, because next week we're going to get into some trickier stuff, electronics and stuff like that. And I want you to have as much resource to write, you know, and take notes as you can. So go over to the file sharing. You should get that handout resource. And a lot of stuff, if you got the book, it would be in the book, but I'm trying to teach you without having to put out the $20 for the book. So at the end of the day, man, you're putting in about 15, 16 hours worth of class and $15 for a test. I think that's a pretty cheap proposition. So Victoria, if you go out and you download PZip, I'm going to type it. It's free. PZip. It is a zip program that you can open and extract this out to. Okay, it's free. It's safe. It's a trusted program. So I wouldn't be giving you some crap program to put on your computer. We use it at work. We used it at Department of Defense. We used it at Homeland Security. So I know that it's a trusted program, free to use. Okay, Marianne, I thank you for coming this week, and we'll see you next weekend. Does anybody need any files that maybe they've missed? So we had the question pool. We had the band plan, which if you download this handout resource, I put the band plan in there. But the study guide is there. We did the PowerPoints tonight. The Part 97 rules, the FCC rules that all these questions are based on. I've handed that out. If there's any files that you're missing, please tell me and we'll put them up here. I'm going to display my alma mater nice and proud here. All right. Man, Dave, you helped me out tonight, man. You were excellent, man. You're a great team player, man. I appreciate you having you on my team. You've even given me some things to remember to put in the next class. So good job, man. Anybody need any files before we shut down? Anything that you don't have? This handout resource, please print it out for next week, please. We're going to get more difficult, and you're going to need to be able to write notes, and it would really help you to print it out. Absolutely, guys. Ladies, it's my pleasure to help you reach this goal. I'm blessed to be part of this journey with you for you to reach this goal. Trust me. I just ask that you pay it forward, and down the road, you help somebody get their license, and that's the best way that we as a community make ourselves stronger. Got to remember, ham radio. We're a network, right? So we've got to pay it forward and help somebody get theirs, and we make our community grow, like-minded people, right? So that's the whole idea, man. That's the paycheck in this, is growing our community of like-minded folks. So the more people in our community, the more prepared we are to communicate. Absolutely. All these handouts, man, I want to make this the least expensive for you guys. You put in the effort. Let's try to cut out the money if we can, right? No sense in spending a lot of money to just get the license. You're already going to have to buy the gear. So my heater is going, too funny. And I'm wearing shorts too, so too funny. Guys, you can see I got a ladder. I've got this is my office and my junk room. This is kind of close the door so nobody can see our tools and all my study books and all my college books and stuff. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and cut off here. It's going on 10:30, and nobody's asked for any files, so hit me up on email, and I'll send them to you individually if we can. And see you guys next week, same time, same bat channel. Talk to you guys later.